Plymouth. We have Gareth Hart of Plymouth Social Enterprise Network and also of Iridescent Ideas Consultancy. And we have Paul White, who is Director of Essence, Exeter's Social Enterprise Network, but also the CE of eCulture Solutions. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Gareth to introduce the subject. And I just want to note that this isn't a new subject, probably for all of us, and that there is a developing and well-tried school of practice in using social value within procurement, certainly of local authorities, but also other institutions and businesses. And going back to the era of financial austerity in 28 and 9, many areas have been finding that they can not only promote their best value, but also relate their procurement to their social goals and the goals of their institutions with benefit to both through involving social value within their procurement. So many publications, some of which are on our Knowledge Hub, and I hope, Roxy, perhaps you could put a reference to that in the chat. So there's lots of documentation of this up to date. But I think for our local traditions and experience, that it's really worth hearing what can be shared. So Gareth, I'll hand over to you to start off with.
Great, thanks, Jill, and good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to see so many people here. I hope you're all feeling sort of healthy and safe as well as we can be in the current climate. So yeah, I'm Gareth Hart. Got a couple of roles that Jill's mentioned, which is I'm one of the directors of Plymouth Social Enterprise Network. I was the elected chair of that organisation for 7 years, from 2013 to 20, where a lot of the kind of backstory of this work has been happening. And the director of my own social enterprise, Iridescent Ideas, and also quite relevant to this discussion is that I'm one of the co-chairs of Plymouth's Inclusive Growth Group, which is kind of changing as we speak into linked to the kind of Regeneration Charter, which I'll talk more about. But that has a real direct link to social value as well. Firstly, I'm not an expert in social value procurement. What I'm going to talk about is how Plymouth Social Enterprise Network and a range of others have kind of lobbied and worked and advocated with the council for social value in procurement in Plymouth, and what we've been doing around that. Particularly right now, we've got a project called Spend for Plymouth, and we're one of the kind of summit attendees of that meeting, which is looking about social value and spending more in Plymouth as a result of the COVID crisis. Just quickly, I mean, as Iridescent Ideas, we've got a vision which is trying to create a more socially enterprise and inclusive economy and do a range of business advice services to do that. So we do a lot of startup advice work, and we do social impact work and things like that. But as Plymouth Social Enterprise Network, it's more kind of relevant to the public debate around social value. And PSEN is an independent members organisation. We've got a simple aim, which is supporting our members' work, a bit like us, Essence as well. We've worked very closely with Paul and Daphne and people at Essence and Torbay and the other social enterprise networks. And really it's about raising awareness of social enterprise in Plymouth and promoting social enterprise as a great way to do business. We were founded in 2010, we have about 80 members. And we were also, one of our claims to fame is that we led the sort of successful bid for Plymouth to become the UK's first social enterprise city in 2013. And actually that was a really important point in the social value conversation, because getting that status made social value and particularly social enterprise much more prominent in the council's thinking way back in 2013. Just a little bit of facts. So you might not know that there's over 200 social enterprises in Plymouth, employing around 9,000 people and bringing in about £600 million a the city every year. And that's a lot of money to spend, both in community wealth building terms, but procuring for social value. But really importantly, some really interesting stats, like nearly 2/3 pay the real living wage compared to a third of standard businesses, 95% involving employees and providing employee well-being. So these are the kind of things we're seeing in the social economy. And I think it's the social economy that's leading the way when it comes to showing real social value in communities. And over the last 5 years, social enterprise has grown in the city. We've doubled the numbers. They employ more people, working in the most disadvantaged parts of the city, and they're bringing in more income. I mean, they're to the city. That's pre-COVID stats. So, I mean, I think that what we're showing in Plymouth is this kind of better way of doing business is a possibility, and where that can be enabled through social value and procurement and commissioning, I think is really powerful. And there are some good moves in Plymouth. It's not all rosy. There are some difficult areas, and I'll talk about those as well. But one of the things we do as Plymouth Social Enterprise Network is we really sort of advocate for a more social economy. We've been working very closely with the Resurgam plan in Plymouth. It's called Resurgam. And what's quite interesting in that is that right at the heart of that, the top level of that Resurgam plan, our council leader said that any recovery plan must address structural inequalities in the city and place a fairer and greener future at the heart of the recovery. We want to grow back better. So I think for me, the ultimate thing about this social value stuff, yes, there's national legislation. I mean, I don't know about the implications of Brexit and OG thresholds and all that technical stuff. You probably know that more than I do. But actually, the politics of this is really important. When Labour Party came to power in Plymouth, it had a manifesto predicated on a whole range of stuff. It doesn't mention social value particularly, specifically, but it does mention quite a lot about a fairer economy, social sort of social enterprises, cooperative development, doubling cooperatives, more inclusive economy. And to me, it speaks directly to the heart of social value. And one of the pillars of our Resurgam plan is this thing called Spend for Plymouth. And really the aims are quite specific: increase 10% of spend in Plymouth, and develop a supplier directory so we get more social enterprises and cooperatives onto that directory. A bit broad and a bit vague at the moment, maximise social value. But that is a real fundamental principle of our economic strategy in Plymouth. That's a really important point, I think. There's been some success already. You know, we don't call it community wealth building in Plymouth. Edward might explain more about that later on. There's this Preston model. We're sort of doing it, but we don't call it that. We don't badge it that. But, you know, 60% of council spending in the first 6 months has gone to local suppliers. That's about a 12% increase, £21 million. We're working really closely with the council on their policies and procurements. There is a social value policy. I'll just quickly share my screen. I'll send this round. This was published in September 2019, sorry. But the previous policy was published in 2016. I mean, this has got some really good stuff in it. In places, it's got some quite detailed stuff in there about the implementation of the plan. There's obviously some areas that need working and developing, but this sets the framework. And if you've not got a policy, I'd advise looking at this, because this is trying to take Plymouth further than just doing the bare minimum. It's actually saying social value is a great way of helping us build back better. You know, and what's quite interesting there is very quickly on the origin story of this. You know, it's like thinking about Spider-Man being bitten by a radioactive spider. How do we, you know, back in 2013, when we got this social enterprise city status, we opened some doors with the council with senior procurement levels and commissioning levels. I mean, we actually did, the Social Enterprise Network trained the council procurement and commissioning teams in social value. And that was really interesting because we're all learning as we go. I do remember one comment from a commissioner though, and she said, isn't this just good commissioning? Which I thought was a really interesting statement, because it sort of is. And there's best value and social value and all these other things going on. But actually, to me, it does go beyond just good commissioning. It's really quite deep and profound. Like on Social Enterprise UK that we work with closely, has done a lot of work nationally, and I'd advise looking at their website and their reports, because there's some really great examples across the country of good social value procurement. I mean, just some specific things. In Plymouth, we're looking at things trying to add a 5 to 20% weighting for social value. They're trying to implement social value under the old OG thresholds. I don't know if those OG thresholds still apply now post-Brexit. But if the council procurement officer doesn't want to put social value in, they have to get that signed off by a senior director or the councillor responsible. So that's a really important point politically, and you know, senior managers, the leadership of this is quite powerful. So there's quite a few specific things in there around, you know, there's the act is often sort of voluntary, but actually in Plymouth we're trying to make it more, not mandatory, but they're trying to put more power into that act. My take on it is this act should be mandatory at a top level. I know national government's done quite a lot of consultation on this. Actually, still quite a lot of work to do to make it, give it more teeth and more power, you know, on goods, services and works on all contracts. Why not, you know? But also going beyond just a weighting, not just adding a weighting for social value. You tell us what you can do, but actually embedding it into thinking around things like the Plymouth plan, the wider economic recovery strategy. And very particularly my area that I'm working on is on inclusive growth. So we're developing this inclusive growth charter. And that inclusive growth for Plymouth is about growing prosperity that's sustainable and environmentally friendly and inclusive. And I can go into the detail of that, but it's one thing we're doing there is trying to get a charter mark for businesses to sign up to, which shows that they're going the extra mile for their businesses. So they employ a living wage. They are, you know, looking at diversity, they are looking at environmental impact, they're looking at their supply chains. And what one of their long-term ambitions is that the council will procure more, I suppose, for social value from organisations with that badge, that charter mark badge, because it's showing that we're building this inclusive, fairer economy. So really, in summary, you know, we want this inclusive economy, one that's productive and prosperous for all. And COVID-19 is showing us that we really have to think about building back better. We've shown us without health, there's no economy. We know that without the environment, there's no economy. So we've got to tackle things like racism and structural inequality and poverty. And they're shown by these events and the talks we've been doing in Plymouth and across the country. You know, for me, it's social enterprises and co-operatives and ethical businesses like that, community businesses that are really leading the way here. And I think if we want to develop this more inclusive, fairer economy, social value is an absolutely key plank of our sort of our tactics, our strategy, our levers we can pull. The one thing in Plymouth, I think, where we haven't quite got it right yet, we need more case studies, we need more examples of where social value has been powerful. And also the council has been good on it, but actually some of the other departments in Plymouth are still a bit cold on it. So the Ministry of Defence, MOD in Plymouth, massive employer in Plymouth, I don't think it's really put social value at the heart of it yet. We've had no real conversations with MOD. Clinical commissioning groups for another one, the health sector, you know, really should be looking at this much more powerfully. So, you know, we fundamentally believe that social enterprise and a cooperative way of doing business is a better way of running the economy. If we can get councils, district councils, city councils, county councils to put social value and really mean it and really show us examples of how we can do it by working together, I think we can create a fairer, more inclusive, more environmentally aware economy. And I can answer questions on more detail as we go. So, but thanks.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That's a terrific introduction to that. And you did mention the CCG. So in their defence, I think I might just mention the collaboration over people with complex needs that they did with the City Council, which is actually a path-breaking collaboration of, you know, investigating who the providers could be and then collaborative commissioning for a whole range of services. And actually, they have hugely reduced the costs of their budget with adults who are, they've reduced the B&B and they've provided specific services for people with complex needs. So I think that's a case study that really justifies their social value conditioning. And okay, so I'll hand over now to Ed, if you could continue.
Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Gill, and thanks, Gareth. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of, as Gill mentioned, build on a bit of what Gareth said and give a little bit of a narrative of where, I suppose, social value fits within the community wealth building debate, particularly here in Plymouth in its own sort of unique way, I suppose. And then, you know, just share with you a more recent example of where we at Real Ideas have been working with the City Council to realise, we're trying to realise greater social value, greater use of the Social Value Act in a more environmental context. And that's through the Future Parks Accelerator and Enrich programme, which is ongoing here at the moment. So I suppose, I mean, the Social Value Act is obviously clearly a really useful instrument in sort of realising and coming, when it comes to ideas of community wealth building, the idea that you can spend more money locally, if not socially, and that circulates more wealth in communities, minimising ideas of sort of leakage and extraction, a more circular economy, if you will. And clearly through, as Gareth has touched on, ideas of spend for Plymouth and the Inclusive Growth Charter Mark, Plymouth's doing quite a lot of this great work, but typically in a rather sort of Plymouth fashion, it's doing it rather in its own kind of way. I suppose you'd be, you know, they don't call it community wealth building, and you'd be pretty hard pressed to find references to community wealth building anywhere in PCC literature. The why they don't call it actually community wealth building, I don't actually know, but I would possibly hazard a guess, and I would sort of underline this is very much my guesswork and sort of intuition. So don't quote me, even though this is being obviously recorded. I mean, I'd suggest really, from my experience, and you know, I think Gareth might agree that, you know, Plymouth, you know, political and officer leadership are, I suppose, pretty well versed and experienced in this kind of work and this kind of philosophy and this kind of thinking. I suppose, therefore, pretty well able to reinterpret these ideas and apply them in their own local context to some, you know, really, really good and developing success. Subsequently, there's been, I suppose, a less of a need and a less of an inclination to sort of bring in and commission maybe, external bodies that might want to come in and help with this, and then naturally slap their own sort of brand on it. And also, I think furthermore, I suggest there's an element of being possibly politically astute here. In terms of brand association, community wealth building is obviously quite heavily associated with Preston and the work that's gone in there, and we're all very familiar with that, and it's quite a clearly defined idea, and therefore quite easy to communicate the idea of a Preston model. And I suppose all that is quite fairly associated with Corbyn, and both those things are slightly sort of yesterday's news. So, and on top of that, rightly or wrongly, I suppose they do divide public opinion a little bit. So I suspect there was a little bit of a desire maybe just to keep some clear water between what's going on here and what's going on there. There is some really interesting comparative research going on between the two places, more in a municipalist framing that maybe we can pick up in the conversations. So on the second bit I wanted to talk about really is just give a quick sort of live and current example of how we're working with the council and partners to realise some greater use of the Social Value Act and social value in the city. And that's through what is the Plymouth Future Parks Accelerator Programme called GEMS. And there's a programme within that called Enrich that we are running. And there's a huge amount in this, but very briefly, the GEMS project, of which Enrich is a part, is seeking to find better ways for us to collectively care for our parks and urban green spaces. And you may well be aware, I expect you are, that parks aren't necessarily statutorily protected services. They're therefore arguably quite expensive to run, and therefore possibly there's a view that they may be under threat. So part of our work is looking at the role that social enterprises, community businesses, cooperatives can play in parks. How can they play a greater role in either the stewardship, the management, the animation of parks, creating good jobs, creating environmental outcomes, creating greater social incomes, also, making potentially budget savings. I suppose clearly there's a huge amount of work through that, and we've been through a sort of co-design phase with about 50, a mixed cohort, about 50 council officers and social enterprise community business activists. And where the Social Value Act has come into play around this, it's around the idea of tendering and leasing of park-based assets, particularly obvious things like cafes and things like that. Now, where this has tended to happen in the past, it's been tendered in a very traditional way, and I guess there's kind of two problems that have come out from that. It's been a sort of traditional tender where, a tender would go out, we will say, it's this much for this building per year, get your tender in 2 weeks and away you go. That's kind of the end of the relationship. No real particular view to date on social and or environmental value. So what happens in practice tends to be these kind of two things. Either you were talking about a building that is often not hugely fit for purpose. It's a bit small, it's a bit clunky, it doesn't necessarily work. It's an old house or something, and people are trying to put a cafe in there. And inevitably what tends to happen then is, those leaseholders don't necessarily invest in the building particularly. They don't necessarily have the resource to sort of do it up and make it more useful. The building struggles, the quality isn't great. And lo and behold, in a year's time, that business has folded, and we've launched back into the same process. It's not particularly great outcome for anybody, and it's sort of this circular thing that goes on and on. The other sort of example that tends to play out is it is potentially a relatively decent building, and some of them are purpose built, but you tend to find a business will compete to go in there. But they're driven purely, there's a hard drive for a pure sort of single bottom line profit margin. And again, what tends to be the outcome in reality is not particularly good offer. There's very little investment into the building, and the building starts getting a bit shabby. And there is very little return environmentally or socially for the wider park. So this was seen as a sort of problem. And I think point to most cafes in parks in Plymouth, it seems like this was sort of going on and fundamentally not giving the outcome that everybody wanted. Hence, there was a really clear opportunity for a greater use of, of the Social Value Act in this. And so we're working now, I suppose, with colleagues. That's been put forward as a recommendation to introduce much more the use of the Social Value Act when it comes to tendering for these buildings. And that's sort of essentially going into place now, and we're working on how that implements. And it all gets, as Gareth touched on, very, very technical all of a sudden, but it seems like fairly straightforward win. And everyone's really on board with that. How do we get better social purpose organisations that are a really good business, got really good at running a sort of food offer and a catering operation, but are committed to can access different additional funding and investment for the building, and are committed to the wider idea of the park and the environmental standards and being part of the sort of park eco and economic sort of ecosystem. And that's, as I say, that's happening at the moment, and that's sort of going forward. And I suppose what I finally want to note, and a side note on that, it was really interesting, and I don't really blame anybody for this, but working with a lot of people that work, in green spaces, in parks, in natural infrastructure, the awareness of the idea of the Social Value Act was very, very low and very limited. And these people are very socially minded, generally very environmentally minded. And just to realise, oh, actually, we can do that. We can actually use this was a really interesting revelation point, and they've really taken hold of that. So that's already, I suppose, a real positive. My final comment would be, that you can do social value and community wealth building in many different ways, and you don't have to call it any of those things, and call it what you like. And while there are some really good examples out there, and we've heard some, and there's some great examples here in Plymouth, we can do and we need to do much more, and it'd be great to find and build on some better examples. And it's great to be part of events like this where we can give it more energy, talk it up, and continue to raise awareness and share practice.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's terrific. I think we have found some of that logic in Exeter as well, with parks and green spaces, and quite an enhanced role for local residents to take an initiative there. Okay, so over to you, Paul, if you'd like to take the floor. I think you're still muted.
That's not clever. Yes, thank you. I'm a technologist and I forget to unmute. That's not a good sign, is it? Hopefully, can you see a presentation screen and a slide? Brilliant. So I'm going to take a little bit of what Gareth has said and translate that to a view of social value defined really by the not-for-profit sector, and a view of Exeter, and how I think that can help influence the discussions that we need to have around the opportunity of social value and the Social Value Act and procurement, and how that can play quite an important role in recovery as we go forward. So I think one of the things probably, and this has been a little bit of a revelation, I think, for many people, is that the extent of the not-for-profit sector, not just in Exeter, actually nationally across the country, is vast. But for Exeter, within the EX1 and EX4 postcode districts, there are over 600 organisations. They employ and utilise volunteer resources of up to 12,000 people from the city in the delivery of services. And 90% of what they do can be categorised as being focused around wellbeing development, so individual, family and community wellbeing development. And the recognition, what the pandemic's done actually is brought a recognition of the value of the not-for-profit sector in the response to the needs of the pandemic, and ultimately has led the public sector into particular into realising that through closer engagement and collaboration, they can achieve some of their sustainability aims in the long term. So that started to influence the conversation around social value and a need to understand better what is being delivered within the local communities and how that impacts people in their everyday lives, certainly with people with needs that need support that they're struggling to get from our public sector that's having a problem meeting demand, that the voluntary sector is stepping into and starting to service. It is a vast sector, and I didn't mention the turnover, but overall there's about 300 million in turnover that's utilised by those groups just in the Exeter area. If we extend that across Devon, it goes up to 1.8 billion if we include Torbay and Plymouth. So it's a vast sector of work. I think the other important thing is the context of care, and we talk about care of our ourselves and our friends and our families, but our communities, our city, our place of where we live, our economy, all of those factors are quite important, and everybody does actually care. So as we've started to have these conversations and we've started to reach out, we've found that actually the level of benevolence within the general population is enormous, and if we empower people and encourage people, they'll do fantastic things. So we've got a base to sort of build from, and we have established precedents already within the communities for how they're taking control and ownership. So Ed mentioned parks as a classic point in case, how people are beginning to say we can look after this space and we can value it better because we live within that community, we appreciate what it means to us. And the context of that means, from a well-being perspective, you know, it's a huge boost to that local community, that local population, and that sense of belonging, of placemaking. And it leads on to a whole host of additional things that start to then deliver value back to things like the public sector. So if we, you know, as we mentioned, if we increase well-being of the population so much that they start to reduce the demand on the public sector, that translates to tangible and real cost savings that can start to be measured. It is all about empowerment and connection and engagement, and that's, I think, for me, is the biggest challenge at the moment, is how do we make those connections? How do we share data in that space? How do we share the intelligence of what's good, what's bad, and learn from those that process? A little bit of a split. So some of the analysis I've been doing for Essence in terms of the breakdown has demonstrated quite an interesting profile. So social enterprises tend to be better off financially. They're generally self-sustaining businesses, so they're thriving. What we tend to find is the numbers of resources that are being utilized in service delivery tend to be greater within the charitable sector, which to some degree is more dependent on an haphazard financial profile, so less potentially sustainable. So there's a challenge for us, I think, in terms of looking at the overall not-for-profit sector and trying to identify ways we can help those less sustainable functions, but nonetheless important ones, become more sustainable as a business concern, potentially still operating on the principles of not-for-profit, but in a position better where they can be commissioned as procurement practices change to deliver services, and so therefore through that commissioning process be empowered more. Traditional procurement rules make it quite difficult to procure from a grant-funded organisation that can't demonstrate financial stability over a decent period of time, whereas obviously a business with a set of accounts over 3 years that demonstrates a reasonable level of cost cover and profitability is much easier for an organisation to make a procurement decision on. So there's an important component there in terms of looking at the profile of services available and how do we, that's delivering real social value at the grassroots level, and how do we leverage that in the right way? And I think well-being is, you know, it's talked about actually in the context of becoming a new measure to replace or potentially sit alongside GDP. New Zealand's taken great strides in this respect. And I think it's something we could focus on. So you might not be able to see the individual numbers in this table, so apologies, it's quite busy. But if we take wellbeing measures, the joint strategic needs assessments that's undertaken by public health all across the country in every different local authority area, and through that identifies social challenges and concerns and issues that we need to be servicing. And if we understand through the academic studies that have been done in multiple universities across the land, the unit costs of those issues, we can start to translate that to some form of measure of progress over time as we start to empower our local communities to start to, you know, self-address some of those challenges that they have within their place. And it obviously increasing well-being and will increase essentially the population's opportunity to contribute economically and socially, and that in itself will start to generate a catalyst of change, and where we will be able to start to see additional social value measures coming through. So there is a baseline that we can work from that will help us understand the practical implications of change that are happening on the ground, and start to establish some better unit of measure that starts to help increase the level of support we can give to that change. And so just to round up, of course, I think some of you might be familiar with the donor economics model and the context of how we potentially implement change, but recognize that we need to do it sustainably from an ecological perspective, and that it needs to be framed. There's a lot of work in progress at the moment in Devon on that. And some of the things I've sort of tried to draw out from the discussions we're in Exeter is very much around, if we can increase the efficiency of that not-for-profit sector, bearing in mind it's a 300 million turnover, a 10% increase in efficiency could be £30 million worth of additional funding that can be repurposed for other needs. 1,000 more people, resources and time being utilised to service needs. If we can increase engagement and collaboration between service providers, that will increase economic activity. If we can translate some of those less sustainable entrepreneurial solutions that are out there in the voluntary and charitable sector to becoming social enterprise, will start to increase economic activity through that means, and in a socially responsible way. And if we start to impact in the reductions on demand on public services, we actually start to set a path for the public service itself becoming more sustainable in what it's been asked to do. And critically, a lot of focus has been given to circular economy opportunities. In the previous slide, I highlighted a number of wellbeing development opportunities. 2.9 billion for Devon. There's 100 million just for the city of Exeter. So if we can start to tap in and again make that positive change, then the value of that can start to become realized quite quickly, and then we can start to assign that to increasing the level of change throughout. And naturally as well, if we take advantage of the not-for-profit sector and the will that's out there within the people to work more with organizations that are more socially responsible, will increase potentially local jobs and local activity within our local economy. So that's what I've been doing with Essence. So that's trying to sort of translate all the great ideas that are up at the top level down to the grassroots, and how has it actually been implemented? Where is the change actually occurring, and how do we realize that to best effect on a broader scale? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great, Paul. Perhaps we can end screen sharing if that's okay. So great. Other questions that are